Alrighty, hello, this is Jonathan. I waved my hands and the camera exploded. That was very funny. The process here is a little weird. I am Jonathan Albin, as I said, and this is going to be a new feature I'm going to do called Beside Myself. And basically, as a interviewer, a person who wants to gather information, I sometimes have questions that I would like to have someone ask me. And so I'm maybe pretentious enough, maybe I'm just silly enough to figure that I could ask me those questions. In this process, therefore, at times, you'll see. Let's see if I can even get it to operate here. Yes, there. So now there are two of us, and one of them's looking that direction and one's looking that direction. So I need to get this one reversed. So give me a second here. Yay! Drama of doing this live. There we go. So, as I said, I'm Jonathan, but I'm also Jonathan. So, Jonathan, I'd like to first of all ask you to introduce yourself a little bit, give the viewers some information. Now, granted, they know a lot about you since this is on your own Facebook page, so they probably already have some information on you. But why don't you give them the quick lowdown? And once I figure out how to pause both of these, we'll be better off. All right, thanks, John. I'm Jonathan, and that's me as well. These programs are brought to you by one of our sponsors, Board Game Paradise. Their logo's right here. They're a store in Redlands, California. If you're out here on the West Coast at any time and want to visit a store that has everything, Board Games Paradise in Redlands is a full-service games store. They cover card games, board games, especially Cult of the New. They are big on the new stuff. And fortunately for me, they also include a role play aspect, so they allow me to bring a role play aspect on Mondays. So if you want to come and participate in the game with us, you can definitely join us Monday nights at 6 p.m. at the Redlands store. It's on State Street in downtown Redlands and not difficult to find. I'm sure you can Google, but Board Games Paradise is a great supporter of the programming that I do, and the owner is a very good friend of mine. As a matter of fact, his passion for games was somewhat incubated, if you will, in my own home because he was a very good friend of my son when they were kids, and now they're still friends. But the issue is that my son's at East Coast and Rich is here, so there you go. So, quick information about myself before I turn it back over to Jonathan to do his part as an interviewer. But I'm a games publisher, writer, designer. I've been involved in the business professionally for the better part of my adult life, entering originally in the 1990s through adventure design and working my way up through the ranks, so to speak. I worked with Konami Digital Entertainment, the company that promotes the Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card brand. I was the tournament liaison in that period. And I also was the marketing director for the Game Manufacturers Association back in the 2000s, supporting and promoting the growth of the GAMA trade show and the Origins Games Convention. And I left formal employ in 2017 and became an author and a writer. And since then, I've published 350 books as a ghostwriter and 9 books under my own name, which you can find on Amazon.com as well as through my own personal site on Lulu.com. And I am also the creator of the upcoming Nycos RPG, the first book of which is now being sent through the processing to publish. And I'm also still continuing as a ghostwriter and author support and book shepherd, if you will, for others that create their own books. Now I'll turn it back over to Jonathan. Give me just a second while I make the transition. Alrighty, so Jonathan, so glad to have you with us for this show today, and thank you for calling out our sponsor, Board Games Paradise. I'm going to get so I can point better with this thing in the future. Yes, my fingers, they're difficult to control. But my cameras are at two different angles, so I apologize for that. Jonathan, before we get started with the questions, I wanted to draw some attention to, you've mentioned Nycos RPG, but the reality is that you've been a games master for very near to 50 years at this point. 1973, I believe, is when you said you started. Could you give us a little bit of information about those early days, things like that, and maybe give us a little bit of illumination on your breadth of understanding of role play games? Should look over there, I suppose. Well, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, the concept of Nycos RPG started a long time ago in the 1970s. Dungeons and Dragons hadn't even actually really been rolled out yet, and a buddy of mine whose grandfather was Dave Arneson invited me to come and play at a games event that they were running, which was it was early in the days of the uh, the I guess you'd start the origins of role playing as an alternative. But when I got involved with the game, I was only 11 years old, and I was very excited and thrilled with the opportunity. And so I chose to play a character, and like me or hate me, when I first started as an 11-year-old, I had literally just seen the. I mean, I just finished reading the Lord of the Rings series. In particular, I just finished a rereading of The Hobbit, which I had done even earlier. But so therefore, I very unimaginatively played a character who was a hobbit by the name of Bilbo Baggins, and it was literally only one session. The opportunity to get to play with the creator was very short. It was just a single event, and it changed my life. It changed everything. I had been always a creative person. I wrote my first science fiction story when I had been in third grade or fourth grade. I still have the silly thing someplace, but it was a 6-page science fiction short story about being abducted by extraterrestrials. I was crazy back then, but I was only a kid, right? So, being 11 years old, I was very impressionable, and the idea of being a storyteller just lit a fire under me. And so I began right there, literally the next day, writing my own stories. Now, to be perfectly candid, the concept of polyhedral dice, although we had them in that play session, I didn't have an opportunity or access to them. So, knowing that I had a set of Yahtzee dice in the house, I went ahead and created my own combat charts. I actually reanalyzed the numbers. I remembered that the statistics had been between 3 and 18, and so I used a numeric bell curve to determine success failure in the games that I was playing. And I started running stories the very next week. And so I've been a storyteller and a dungeon master, games master for all of those years since then. It was the one, other people buy into a hobby or get into a sport and they play it for a while and then they change it up and get out of it and move to something else. In my case, I didn't. I just kind of plugged along, creating new stories, new ideas. I'm a prolific and have always have been a prolific reader and consumer of video media product and such like. So all of the different fantasy genre and even non-fantasy genres that came into my eye sockets, so to speak, and started to feed into my imagination caused the story to develop. All right, so the length of time that you've been involved is pretty impressive. I don't know that I've ever met anybody that, well, I've met somebody, but most people have not known anybody to have the kind of durational experience as you. I mean, a 48-year run as a game master with no session breaks to speak of, that averages to one game session a week is pretty impressive. So the stories that you tell then therefore have evolved over time. Can you tell us a little bit about the concepts of games? Because a lot of people who play role play games don't have the breadth of knowledge or the extent of knowledge of things that you've covered. So can you tell us a little bit about what you see as the say differences between different kinds and types of role play that are out there? Sure. When you look at role play in terms of role play games, there are a lot of different ways those sessions can play out. Generally speaking, that a regular session is somewhere between an hour to 4 hours upwards to the marathon sessions that you start on a Friday night and you don't finish until Saturday afternoon when everybody's like passing out tired. The differences between the different types of sessions make a real difference, and I think that there are a lot of things that confuse the world today simply because the properties and availability of role play experience that people are able to access are held or contrived by the people who provide the content. So uh, when I speak of a role play, you can break it down into basically three different categories that I utilize in the Nycos RPG. First of which is a session. Getting 3 to 4, maybe even 5 or 6 people together to play a role play game itself is rather daunting, and simply being able to get together for a single session can be difficult. And so there are adventures and conditions that you can put together where the players conclude the adventure in that one period, and that's called a session. And an individual session, separate from other sessions, does not define or become categorized, if you will, as a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Even if you run separate sequential sessions, unless there is an overarching story. A story, for example, that might take 3 or 4 or 5 episodes or sessions would be therefore considered to be a series. A series of adventures would happen within perhaps a framework of a larger campaign if those pieces apply to a greater story than what is happening. But a session generally is singular and a single standing condition that gets resolved in the role play. In the case of a series, then you've got 4 or 5 or 6 or 25 individual sessions that are linked together to create or tell a larger story. And some people would consider a series to be is equivalent, if you will, to a session in terms of it being standalone. The idea of telling the short story, the travel from point A to point B can be a story, and that story therefore can play out over individual sessions. But that travel from point A to point B doesn't necessarily have to play into a larger story arc and can actually be self-contained. Finally, the last stage of that would be the saga. And the saga is a story that is generally long form. In my case, the saga is a 6.5-year campaign of sessions that are all interlinked. In other words, everything that you do in the week over week play is part of that greater story. Now, if we don't take that into account, if we don't hold to a saga, the individual sessions that you play in the vernacular gets to be called a campaign loosely, only because it's the same storyteller carrying forward the story. Although you could even go one step further and say that if you have multiple storytellers who all agree to a greater story arc, each of those individual sessions or even series of sessions could play into a larger campaign if the characters and the direction and the purpose of those game events all played into that greater overall story arc. I tend to differentiate them only because I've been doing it so long that I can see the differentiation. And when I say that I'm playing long story arc, I have created a 6.5 year story arc, which is a saga, and then that saga itself repeats every 6.5 years to 7 years as I start the next iteration, if you will, of that saga. I hope that explains what you were. Hope that was what you were aiming at. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. That is really important that we take that into account. Now, I would argue that the players' vernacular today is kind of skewed, if you will, because the inputs that we have are so broad, whether they be at the really highly professional end that include the Critical Role series or something like that, where they play their individual story arcs over a longer period and then have seasons, and so therefore they start season over season. And perhaps I'm a bit ignorant. I do not know whether those link from one to the next to the next, so they might be sequential. But when if someone were to say to you, "Yeah, I'm running a campaign on Saturdays," and the characters change from one campaign to another, or from one session to another, not only in character class and positioning in the story, but in the individual sessions, there's a specific noted group of characters, and the characters even change from session to session. What is your reaction to people calling that a campaign? Well, Jonathan, the players are gonna play. Players are gonna say what they feel, and I only want to make sure that we differentiate the two in terms of the license or the agency of the storyteller. With many of the role players today playing within the framework of the materials that are provided by the designer of the roleplay system that they're using, that tends to almost force a campaign feel, a saga feel on the players, almost as if they have to keep those stories within that same framework. Now, since my campaign, my original saga, started outside of the framework of a created world made by someone else, the story therefore feels, for me at least on the saga level, to be more continuous and more focused than perhaps other properties. I do know that in the early period of time, especially when you're talking about the late 70s, early 80s, the very idea of a long form story wasn't really played into. Many of the designers and publishers were creating property that literally was, there's a hole in the ground, go dig in the hole in the ground and see what you find. And, knock down the doors, take the treasure, move on to the next room. That concept of map delving and such really didn't lend itself to a long story arc, even though ironically the roots of roleplay were actually predicated from the concept of dealing with units left over after warfare, war conflicts, and that kind of thing. Most people don't even haven't even followed the tracking on that to look at the fact that when Dungeons and Dragons was devised, the people who were doing the creation were actually trying to resolve the question or conflict about what happens to a military unit that's been demoralized on a foreign field, and how they interact with that and how they make their way home. So, although the original concept lent itself to the long form, the actual mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons with the idea of a short form encounter series was actually lending itself to a one shot or a single session kind of mechanism. It was only later, as the designers became more sophisticated and more integrated into the very process of creating materials, that the development of modules came about. I'm not supposed to be asking questions. It's supposed to be up to you. I'm turning it back over to you. All right. So, yeah, I'm glad you stopped there because I needed to get a word in edgewise. That you tend to tell a lot of stories and carry on for a long time, and I don't want this show to run too long since this is our preliminary, and I don't even know how well it'll go over with the people who even know me. I do want to mention those of you that are interested. We do have a Patreon program, patreon.com/Nycos, Nycos. That is our process by which we are developing the Nycos RPG. And if you enjoy this show so far, make sure you like it, follow me, and also take a look at the patreon.com/Nycos website to get more information on how you can become a part of this and join our team. I do have an extended video that I have released about the Nycos RPG that will go into more details. But before that, I'm going to get back to the interview here. So, Jonathan, in those early days, the idea of a module developed. I believe it was a process by which the designers of stories could actually create packets, if you will, that would be relatively low-cost entry points for dungeon masters to pick up resources and stuff. Can you give us maybe a few minutes about that? And once we get done with that, I do want to just lead you a little further down the road. We need to go ahead and also talk about the Nycos RPG in particular. But going back to this particular question, early on, as the properties were being developed, there were modules. Can you tell us a little bit about your history with modules? Yeah, sorry for that. We had a button issue there. Couldn't get me turned back on. Yeah, the original release of Dungeons and Dragons in actual mechanical terms were a box set that gave the rudiments of how to play a series, the polyhedral set that now has become really stable at 7 dice, and the tables necessary to determine success failure on the dice rolls, as well as equipment lists and some basic information on the various. Back then, the terms class and race hadn't really been differentiated, but back then the information would include a little bit about how to play an elf, how to play a halfling, how to play a dwarf, and things like that. And the die rolling mechanism actually was set up so that the players would roll the dice, and then from the dice rolls determine what the character was they were going to play. Now, over time, that evolved to the point where in today's role-play environment, you don't go with that hardcore, what the dice say is what you play. Instead, you actually choose what you want to play and then modify the positioning of the dice rolls to make sure they fit. But in those early days, role-play was really more about the exploration of the different possible roles you might play. So when you would roll the dice, then you would look at the numbers and their positioning and say, oh, well, this guy's got a fairly moderate strength, but he's got a really high wisdom. So maybe he'd be good in terms of a religious leader, a clerical role, and in game mechanics that later was defined to actually be specifically the healer role. But initially, he was a religious leader and was still affiliated with some form of deity and things like that, because it was, again, sort of, it was fantasy, but it was fantasy with a historical aspect, and therefore lent itself to stories of the Greeks, stories of the English in history or whatever. So add to that the fact that it was predicated in large part to the concepts of the high fantasy games, the deeper lore stories like Lord of the Rings and such like that, that the individual stories were too big, if you will, for a player to just to grasp all of it. And so the printers, the publishers realized also that the audience for games was skewing considerably younger. There were, it was, well, in a previous video, I went into the history of games in particular and how the direction of the Hassenfeld brothers to guide themselves away from a adult games community and into a youth role-play community meant that the game needed to skew to younger folk, and therefore to not as high a budget for purchase. You know, the idea was the original. I remember fighting forever to raise enough money to get myself the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guides, because they were topping out at, I believe it was $15, and that was, you know, for a kid on an allowance, or a kid with a very limited side hustle, so to speak. I think I had a newspaper route or something like that at the time. It was difficult to gather the money together to do that, but once the modules were released, it made it a lot easier. And a module was a property put out by Dungeons and Dragons that TSR would actually publish a packet of information that would be able to be used by a storyteller to use as a framework for telling his own tale within that framework, and would also add elements from the not yet fully developed IPs that later became Blackmoor, Greyhawk, even later with the Faerun and Dragonlance series. Those individual worlds developed over time, but initially the modules weren't particularly tied in particular to a specific world, but were ironically tied to special physical events. These events, I assume that you're talking about the beginnings of what would today we would call them meetups or whatever. The mechanism was actually conventions and events that were held at locations, wherein the play actually was a scoring mechanism. They originally had Dungeons and Dragons tournaments and such, where people would go and test their skill against other players in the game, and also at the same time discover new ways to play the characters that they were familiar with. So how soon did you get involved with the campaign process, might I ask? It seems like that's an obvious place that a young man would want to get involved with to further his craft as storyteller. Funny you should say that. Yeah, there were, even in the earliest releases of the role-play games materials, there was a single sheet that was slid into the back of most of the books, if I recall correctly, that was an invitation to join the role-playing guild. And that role-playing guild would allow you to build a character that you would take to a campaign or a story, and then you would meet with other players at the. Um, boy, I'm blanking right now, and I'm sure people can tell me. They put it in the comment section. The role playing guild. I can't remember what it's called. But anyway, yeah, that was there. But ironically, I lived in the Midwest. I was born and raised mostly in the Midwest, and early on, especially, I didn't have access to a full service game store, unlike our sponsor, Board Games Paradise, which does carry every possible sort of game. In my communities, when I was a young man, there weren't any game stores. As a matter of fact, I would travel to my aunt's house and visit the one nearest her house, which was Daylight Hobbies in Aurora, Colorado. Would be the only one that I was aware of finding, and I only got to visit that once a year or so when we visit my aunt. But so although I did have the access to join the guild if I wanted to literarily, there was no real justification for it because I couldn't make it to any of the events. As a matter of fact, even though I saw those flyers every year, and I started in the 1970s, I didn't attend a professional convention where those kinds of organizations were accessible to me until 1992. And there's a whole story there, which I'm going to go into in a later video. But I do know you said you had something else you wanted to ask me about before we finished up today. So let me get off of my podium and turn it back over to you for a moment. All right, yeah. So, yeah, we will definitely go into the process and what happened in 1992 and stuff in a later video. But my question right now is, can you give us just a snippet about what is setting the Nycos RPG apart from the other offerings that are available now for roleplay? I think that the viewers might be interested in knowing a little bit about where that's going and what that's about. All right, one of these days we're going to get those buttons down so I make those transitions a lot faster. But yes, the Nycos RPG is a revolution in roleplay for a bunch of different reasons. And by a bunch of different categories. Let's just say simply that Nycos RPG is a single volume book that provides you all the rules you need to play through virtually any role-play environment, condition, situation that you want to in the high fantasy setting. The rules do specify and include creation aspects for players to create their own magical effects. It embraces the concepts of an extensive number of player species. There are, I believe, 35 different species that a person can play. One of the keys in differentiation is that although race is used, it only specifically is referring to the species differences. So, for example, it has a specific section on Eldrin, which are allegorical to elves, the Grundim, which are allegorical to dwarves and such like. But those individual groupings don't have any differentiation between like for example, in the category of human, you are human. There's that is your race. That is your species. There's no differentiation by any characteristic other than that. Furthermore, there's no mechanical comparisons made between the masculine and the feminine, only because in the scale of a fictional world, there is no need for those kind of differentiations. And the concept here is to embrace players where they are and let them play what they want to play. Now, other things that set it apart is that there are unlimited advancement. Players actually control their own progression without the direct and somewhat imperious oversight of a storyteller, so the players evolve their characters session over session by their own advances. The storyteller and the players can both create and advance new concepts that aren't even, you know, published in the book, so to speak, and that's all okay because every storyteller is different, every player is different, and so we want to be able to embrace all of that. And then finally, the mechanics of the game, get rid of the burdensome and somewhat onerous combat slogs that other games have, and put the conflict to a more, I guess you'd say, more visceral way of handling rather than the minutia of, you know, articulating points and such. So there's a lot more to it than that, but I would highly recommend that your viewers check out Nycos RPG. NycosRPG.com is our website. It's still still in development, so it's not perfect, but there's a lot more information for you at patreon.com/Nycos. And of course, you can always direct message Jonathan Albin via this Facebook page, and also through Nycos RPG, which is a games group that is developed specifically for that purpose. I do want to thank you for allowing me to be a part of your show, and I hope that things work well in the future and that we can do more of these Beside Myself episodes in the future. Thanks again, Jonathan. Alrighty, well that's great, Jonathan. Thanks for the information on the Nycos RPG. I'm sure our viewers will be interested in that kind of information. I want to thank you for your time on the show, and I hope to see you again in a future episode of Beside Myself. Also, I'm sure that our roles will adapt from session over session, and there may be a lot of new information. I do look forward to our stories about how you got started back in the 1990s, and why did it take you almost 20 years from when you started playing to become involved with this as a professional passion, given all of the years of experience that you already had even at that point. I mean, we're talking 1990s, so what is that, almost 20 years of role play. So again, thank you for your involvement, and I hope to see you again. Thank you to you, the viewers, for watching it and being a part of our episode here. I hope to see you all in future endeavors. I am Jonathan Albin, and you are on, of course, Jonathan G. Albin's Facebook page. So it's the easiest way to get hold of me in the world, right there. Or you can actually reach out through the other venues we've operated. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram and just about everywhere as Nycos RPG. And thank you very much, and we hope to see you again in a future episode. I am Jonathan Albin, the interviewer, and he's Jonathan Albin, the games master, and we hope to see you all again real soon.